Landcare's changed a lot since I've been familiar with it, since, the start in the 1980s. I speak to people in volunteer groups now who are still involved in this thing. They're very often the same people that were involved in the 1980s. Society has changed very significantly in that time. The social economic factors that have been at work, which have seen capacity and capability shift to some extent from regional areas to peri-urban and urban areas. There's been a drift of population from the bush, and there have been a whole string of things other than the way governments fund land care and natural resource management, which have led to those changes. In some ways, the sorts of things that the Conservation Council have been looking at recently are ways in which we can bring the capability and capacity of the people in the city and urban centres and large regional centres out into the bush to assist the natural resource management processes where the capacity constraints are quite significant. This talk relates to how we can do that in relation to monitoring capacity. If those of you choose to go to the Attending the Tracks forum later on, that's a different model of how we can bring a constituency that's largely based in cities and regional centres out to actually provide physical assistance with on-ground activities in regional areas, with all the potential benefits of breaking down the so-called urban-rural divide that people talk about a lot these days. However, my talk's about monitoring, and specifically, it's about adaptive management. Now, who knows what adaptive management is? Not many. Yeah, right, okay. Broadly speaking, adaptive management is learning by doing. In other words, if we don't actually look at the outcomes of our efforts and learn from them, then we continually reinvent the wheel. We also have a problem of explaining what we're doing to the rest of the population and encouraging people who might provide resources that we actually know what we're doing and capable of producing a particular outcome or result. So the adaptive management process starts with a program or project which has a set of objectives, and to achieve those objectives, presumably a set of strategies. And then we go out and do things, carry out certain actions or put in certain inputs, planting trees, whatever it might be. And then we might have proximal monitoring of what we're doing, how many of those trees actually survive for the first 6 months or something else. And then what tends to happen is the money runs out and we don't get to that next stage, which may in some cases take years to unfold in a particular landscape, or at least it may take years. Or in some cases you might get away with, a year or a little bit longer. So the adaptive management loop doesn't get closed. And that potentially has consequences. One is we don't learn ourselves about what worked and why. We can't transmit that information to the rest of the people in our sector about what's worked and why. We can't translate that information to decision makers about what works and why. And we rapidly lose interest with our volunteers because they can't see the efficacy of their efforts in terms of results. So adaptive management is a very important process. It doesn't happen very often in any more than the informal sense. And our sector is no orphan in that. It's not done well in government. It's not done well in industry either. Because no matter where you are, we all suffer from the indignities of short-termism in the face of long-term problems. So I guess these are the problems that certainly I identify why we don't do adaptive management well. One is the one we're all familiar with, the short-term project funding. The other one is that there is limited capacity and capability in most of the land care sector to actually measure outcomes in a robust manner, which is scientifically defensible. Not universally the case, but you'd have to say most small groups would struggle with doing that kind of work in a valid way. And then, of course, there's a general decline in the people participating in land care in certain parts of the land care world, most particularly in regional areas. And that's driven by a whole range of factors, things like ageing population, the fact that in the 1980s people were retiring at 55 and were hale and hearty and ready to spend another 15 or 20 years being volunteers. Now you'd be lucky to recruit a volunteer at 80 if you... there's that sort of issue. Obviously changes in political priorities and directions, people moving out of the smaller rural communities into larger ones or into cities, all sorts of factors that are influencing that. So maybe the solution, or a temporary or part-time solution, is that somehow we have to harness the capacity we have where the people are and take it out to where the people aren't to help with the national objectives of NRM. So my example is a project that we've been doing with Gondwana Link. I don't think many of you will need an introduction what Gondwana Link is all about, but basically it's about restoring landscapes in the fragmented region in southern Australia so that we have a continuous swathe of native vegetation and hopefully restored landscape processes across a vast region of the state. The Gondwana Link vision has been rolling out for more than 2 decades now, but re-veg certainly has been going on in the fragmented parts of the Gondwana Link corridor since, well, the earliest attempts were, way back in the 1980s, but as a sort of consistent long-term program has been going on since about 2004. So we're concentrating our project in the fragmented component of the link, which is the forest to Stirling's component of the link, the area between the Porongrups and the Stirlings, and the big area between the Stirlings and the Fitzgerald. And this is the sort of landscape that we're working in. There have been gradual evolution of restoration projects. Probably the earlier ones are more like revegetation projects, and the latter ones more accurately determined as restoration projects. Since 2004, to be fair, when we've been assessing these things, it has to be recognised that not only has the technology changed over time, but some sites were obviously set up with objectives which might have been about planting native vegetation, but they weren't necessarily about biodiversity. They were about other values such as producing sandalwood or carbon or oil mallees or whatever it might be. And yet we have included those sites with those slightly contrasting objectives into an assessment about how different restorations practices have contributed to the development of ecological processes in the restored areas. So we have in 2017 a selection of sites that we could have looked at. They're not chosen at random, they're chosen because they're representative of a particular time and a particular treatment of sites. There's just some examples of a sort of different sort of appearance of these revegetation areas now. So we use, for this purpose, we've been using bird monitoring. Simple reason from a citizen science point of view that you use birds or bird communities is that we have a much larger constituency in natural history segment of the community of people who are familiar with working with birds. Working with birds can be done without a lot of the legal requirements in terms of obtaining permits and all the other things, and in the expertise for many of the other potential indicators which may well be at least as useful in looking at ecological development of restoration. But the fact is that most of them rely on having specialist expertise for purposes like taxonomy and other things, which would mean hiring consultants, which would mean rapidly becomes something that's not reasonably feasible to be done on a repeated basis by Landcare groups. So we have managed teams of volunteer bird observers, and it's actually very important. This is not a random process where we invite people to go and do some sampling when they feel like it. It actually has to be concentrated in a managed way in order to get the sampling intensity that you need to do anything that's remotely valid from a statistical perspective. And there's no way you can get teams of volunteers working effectively if they're not coordinated. It just doesn't happen by osmosis. It actually has to be done. We sampled in 2017 14 Gondwana Link restoration sites dating from 2004 up until 2014 with a rough minimum threshold of 10 hectares of to make sure we had a reasonable patch size for expression of bird communities. And we also did 8 reference patches in remnant vegetation that was proximal to the sites that we were looking at. The sites were located, as I mentioned earlier, in the fragmented parts of the Gondwana Link, both sides of the Stirlings and in the Fitzsterling region. And during the actual surveys, not while we were present on site, but while we were actually doing the surveys, we encountered 99 species during that survey. The hybrid standard search method is a way of doing a census where the results of the actual count determine when the count ends, rather than having an arbitrary time limit on counts like you would with an atlas survey. You'll find that, and we found, and you can show you in the data, that most of the sorts of counts that are done, for example, under the bird atlas, grossly undersample bird communities in patches. So we have an intensive process using a method that's not time limited, but actually determined by what actual proportion of the bird community is actually being censused. And we have a very high level of replication at each site. This is the spread of the sites through the Gondwana Link, the red dots. They actually straddle 2 sort of bioregional areas, and even within the eastern one, the birds are telling us that there's probably a sort of another bioregion inside that. So, sampling intensity. So this is a generalised plot of how much time it took to get 90% of the birds in a bird community that were ultimately found to be present in a particular restoration or remnant patch. And basically in that part of the world, you need around about 8 hours of sampling at dawn and dusk at each site to actually get a complete survey of the birds in that bird community. And this is using a simple biodiversity index or bird diversity index on the restoration sites. And there's some very interesting things going on here. One is that there's a group of sites over here which are recent, using modern restoration technologies, which have quite high values already in terms of the index of the bird community diversity. But you also see over here there's something that suggests something of a trend in biodiversity of bird communities in those sites. And you'll notice that the diversity index actually decreases with time since the project was actually undertaken, which is the exact opposite of what you'd expect. You would expect vegetation would develop over time, and it'll become ecologically more complex, more niches, more ecological processes occurring as indicated by the birds as time goes on. But no, that's not what's really been happening here. Now, slight precautionary note, when I said earlier we didn't choose these sites at random, we choose them because they were representative of different times and different approaches to native vegetation re-veg. But if you take out those less than 4 years old sites, you get a significant regression. So what's that saying is that the modern or recent methods that are being used now in the Gondwana Link to restore farmland are producing ecological models which are much more similar to remnant vegetation much more quickly than the sites we did in the past. So we're getting up to, and with some sites now, that within 5 or 6 years, the bird community in those sites very closely resembles our reference sites, whereas many sites that were done earlier, not all, because one over here, Chingarup, did reasonably well for its time, did very well for its time, but it's still lagging significantly behind much more recently treated areas. So what this is not a curve of ecosystems recovering over time. It's a curve which represents how well we now do ecosystem restoration compared to how well we used to do it. There's all sorts of interesting implications in that. One is that some of these sites down here are never, look like they're blocked and they're not actually going to develop into functional ecosystems that match what goes on in the surrounding environment. Some of them perhaps were never meant to be. They were meant to be used for sandalwood, mainly for sandalwood harvesting or for carbon. But another question that is being asked in terms of landscape restoration and activity is how far do we need to go to get a biodiversity benefit, and how great does that biodiversity benefit have to be? There's little doubt that all native revegetation has a biodiversity benefit, but it also says that if you actually want to get something that actually resembles the natural environment and interacts with it in much the same way, that you have to go that extra step, which is actually creating something that emulates natural ecosystems, which some of the modern methods are starting to do quite efficiently. And that, of course, has lots of implications. I'm going to be designing a landscape restoration program. There's a role for all sorts of different land uses in that. They all make a contribution. But if we're going to be claiming high levels of biodiversity benefit, then some carbon plantings and sandalwoods and oil mallees don't necessarily cut it to meet those requirements. So. This is a dendrogram which looks at the similarity between the bird communities at the different both reference and restoration sites. Far too much detail in that to talk about it now, but what you're looking for is for restoration sites to be paired off with their local reference site at a low level, and over time the closeness of the bird communities between restoration and local reference should increase. Also, you'll tend to see that a lot of early restoration sites tend to get clustered together because they tend to be used by lots of opportunist bird species in the early stages of development, which gradually get replaced by less opportunist species as time goes on. Another approach that we're taking, it's all very well to talk about how many species there are in a particular restoration patch, or how closely they resemble reference areas, but the other issue might be, well, not what birds are present, but what sorts of birds are present in terms of their ecological functions that they perform or reflect in that vegetation. To do that, you have to look at your bird community and try and classify different birds into what we call functional groups. For the Gondwana Link, we've got 10 functional groups. And if you look at a cluster of sites that are fairly close together, you can compare the number of bird species in each of these groups to look at what what resources are available to birds in the different restoration types and what's missing, which are also, if you like, windows into what processes are now occurring inside those restoration areas and which ones are still absent. So these first two are replicates of exactly the same site in different weeks. It's very comforting because their functional groups are almost identical, even though they were done by a completely different set of observers at a different time. And then we have a very successful 6-year-old restoration site here, which is already starting to get some of these FG1s, which are the old growth species present in it, and similar numbers of 2s. And then we start to get increasingly either higher numbers of opportunists in some of these younger sites and the absence of some of the old growth type species that we associate with mature vegetation. So, can we use citizen science-based bird monitoring to look at NRM interventions, and particularly in this case, whether or not our ecological restoration is actually ecological restoration or not? And I think the answer is yes, but only under certain circumstances. One is we have to manage type 1 errors. Type 1 errors in science are where you say something is occurring or is there and it isn't. Could occur, for example, if you had misidentifications of birds. We manage that because we train our observers to try and reduce that probability, and we also rotate observers through the same sites so we can pick up errors that may have been made. So we reduce our type 1 errors that way. Type 2 errors are when we miss something. And you avoid missing something by making sure you've got enough sampling effort. So remember we did in this particular context, you need 8 hours of replicated surveys at dawn and dusk to make sure you don't miss something. So you have to make sure the intensity is appropriate. And then fundamentally important to this kind of approach is that we have to use coordinated teams of trained volunteer citizen science in concentrated campaigns, not the sort of thing you do, occasionally on a Saturday afternoon. It actually has to be done in a concentrated, dedicated way. And what we're obviously looking to do as Cons Council is using the capability that we built to partner with NRM organisations so that we can bring teams in and meet their monitoring requirements in a relatively efficient way. And then, of course, we have to develop and nurture that citizen science base that we need to carry out that kind of work. So I'll leave it at that.